I trusted him to drive me home after 3 months together. Then he said these shocking words at midnight. At 34, I thought I understood what respect looked like in a relationship. I had a solid career as a marketing coordinator, my own Honda Civic, and what I believed was a promising connection with someone who seemed to share my values. Christopher and I had been seeing each other for 3 months, and every interaction had painted him as thoughtful, considerate, the kind of man who opened doors and actually listened when you spoke. But one Tuesday evening in downtown Portland would completely obliterate every assumption I'd made about his character, leaving me emotionally eviscerated in ways I never thought possible. The setup seemed innocent enough. Christopher, who worked as an IT technician in the suburbs about 45 minutes from my apartment in the Pearl District, had suggested we try this trendy bar and mini golf combo that had just opened near his office. "It'll be perfect," he'd said over the phone, his voice carrying that warm enthusiasm I'd grown to associate with our dates. "I can meet you there straight from work around 7:30. I know it's a bit of a drive for you, but I promise it'll be worth it." The way he said it, with such genuine excitement, made navigating the unfamiliar road seem like a small adventure rather than an inconvenience. What struck me as particularly thoughtful was his consideration about timing. "I wish I could pick you up," he'd explained, "but I don't get off until 6:30, and with traffic, I'd barely make it there myself by 7:30. But hey, at least I won't be drinking since I'll be driving you back afterward." That last part filled me with such warmth. Here was a man who planned ahead, who thought about my safety, who understood that being the designated driver was just part of being a decent partner. 3 decades of dating experience had taught me that this kind of consideration was rare, precious even. I remember the drive over, windows down, music playing, feeling genuinely excited about the evening ahead. The bar was tucked into this renovated warehouse district I'd never explored, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, the kind of place that made you feel sophisticated just by walking through the door. Christopher was already there when I arrived, looking handsome in his navy button-down, sleeves rolled up in the casual professional way that suggested competence without trying too hard. The first few hours unfolded like a scene from a romantic movie. We laughed over craft cocktails with names I couldn't pronounce. His pudding technique was charmingly terrible, and our conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of two people genuinely enjoying each other's company. I found myself thinking, as I watched him line up what had to be his 10th failed putt, that this was what I'd been searching for all these years. Someone who could make the ordinary feel extraordinary, who understood that the best relationships were built on these simple, perfect moments. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel different, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Christopher seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently, his responses becoming slightly shorter, his smile not quite reaching his eyes the way it had earlier. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe he was just tired from his day, that I was reading too much into subtle shifts in energy that probably meant nothing at all. Around 11 o'clock, as the mini golf course began to empty and the bar started playing the universally recognized last call music, Christopher stretched and said, "Well, this has been great, but I should probably head out soon." The casual way he said it, like we were college friends wrapping up a study session, sent the first real chill down my spine. "Absolutely," I replied, assuming we'd be leaving together. "Just let me grab my jacket from the booth." That's when the ground beneath me began to crack. "Oh, I meant I should head out," Christopher said, not meeting my eyes as he pulled his wallet from his back pocket. "You're good to get yourself home, right?" The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable landing with the weight of complete disbelief. For a moment, I was certain I'd misheard him, that my brain was somehow scrambling perfectly reasonable words into something that couldn't possibly be what he'd actually said. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed, my voice smaller than I'd intended. The ambient noise of the bar suddenly seemed impossibly loud, the cheerful chatter of other couples planning their drives home together, creating a soundtrack of normalcy that made this moment feel even more surreal. "I'm just really beat," he said, still not looking at me directly, his attention focused on counting out bills for the tip. "It was a long day, and I've got another early morning tomorrow. You understand, right?" The casual tone, as if he were declining to split dessert rather than abandoning me in an unfamiliar part of the city at nearly midnight, was what finally shattered my ability to process this as anything other than what it was, a complete moral failure. The moment I saw him slide his wallet back into his pocket with that air of finality, my entire world crumbled. This wasn't just about transportation. This was about discovering that the man I'd been falling for, the one who'd spent 3 months convincing me he was different, had been a carefully constructed illusion. The depth of his deception was beyond anything I could have imagined, because the cruelest part wasn't that he was abandoning me. It was that he genuinely seemed to believe this was acceptable behavior. "Christopher," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "The buses don't run this late between our neighborhoods. I checked the schedule on the way over here because I wanted to know my options." This was a lie. I hadn't checked because I'd trusted his promise to drive me home. But something about his casual dismissal made me want to see how he'd respond to being directly confronted with the consequences of his choice. He shrugged, actually shrugged, as if my transportation crisis was a mildly interesting weather update. "Can't you just call an Uber or something?" The dismissive way he said it, like he was suggesting I simply try a different flavor of coffee, completed my emotional annihilation. Here was a man who made decent money in tech, who just watched me carefully budget my drink orders throughout the evening, suggesting I drop what would likely be $60 or $70 on surge-priced ride-share like it was pocket change. "The Uber will cost me almost $80 with surge pricing," I told him, pulling out my phone to show him the estimate, somehow still hoping this was all a misunderstanding, that showing him the financial impact would snap him back to his senses. "I didn't budget for that because you said you'd be driving me home." Christopher glanced at the screen for maybe half a second before handing my phone back. "Yeah, that's rough," he said, with the same tone someone might use to acknowledge that traffic was particularly heavy. "But hey, at least you'll get home safely, right?" The way he reframed abandoning me as somehow being concerned for my safety was so audaciously manipulative that I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a tectonic plate finding a new position. As I stood there in that trendy bar, surrounded by couples making normal, considerate plans to leave together, watching Christopher gather his keys with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose evening had gone exactly according to plan, I experienced a clarity that was almost spiritual in its intensity. This wasn't just thoughtlessness. This was a window into his soul, a preview of every future moment when my needs would be weighed against his convenience and found wanting. "Well," I said, my voice steady with a calmness that surprised even me, "I guess I'd better call that Uber then." The look of relief that crossed his face when I didn't push back further was the final piece of evidence I needed. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment. This was who he was. Christopher gathered his jacket, kissed my cheek with the perfunctory affection of someone checking a box, and said, "Text me when you get home, okay? And let's definitely do this again soon." The audacity of that last statement, the assumption that there would be a next time after this display of fundamental character failure, was almost beautiful in its complete disconnection from reality. As I watched him walk away, his stride confident and unburdened, disappearing into the parking lot toward his reliable sedan while I stood alone under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the bar's entrance, I felt the last pieces of my romantic illusions turn to dust. But underneath the devastation, something else was beginning to grow. Something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. The Uber ride home was a masterclass in expensive humiliation. $73.47 to travel the same distance Christopher could have covered in his sleep, while surge pricing turned what should have been a 30-minute drive into an hour-long tour of Portland's late-night surge zones. As I watched the fare climb higher with each traffic light, I found myself not thinking about the money I was hemorrhaging, but about the phone call I was going to make the moment I got home. Because here's what Christopher didn't know about me. I had connections. 3 months of casual conversation had revealed that we had several mutual acquaintances in Portland's tight-knit professional community, including my friend Jessica, who happened to work in HR at Christopher's company. More importantly, Christopher had been enthusiastically planning to introduce me to his colleagues at their annual summer barbecue the following weekend, an event he'd been describing as crucial for his image as a stable, relationship-ready professional. 20 minutes after I'd walked through my apartment door, I was on the phone with Jessica, recounting the evening's events with the precision of someone who understood exactly how certain stories spread through professional networks. I'm not asking you to do anything, I told her, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I just thought you should know the kind of person you're working with, especially given that he's apparently planning to bring dates to company functions. Jessica's response was everything I could have hoped for and more. "Oh my God," she said, her voice rising with genuine outrage. "That's absolutely horrible. And honestly, this explains so much about some of the complaints we've been getting about him from female colleagues. Nothing actionable, just a pattern of inconsiderate behavior that makes more sense now." But the real gift came when Jessica mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Christopher had been telling everyone at work about his new girlfriend, describing me in terms that suggested a level of seriousness and commitment that our actual relationship had never approached. "He's been saying you two are practically living together," Jessica laughed, "talking about future plans like you're already engaged. It's actually been a little concerning how quickly he's been escalating things in his head." That information was the key to everything. Because Christopher wasn't just a thoughtless date who'd abandoned me at a bar. He was someone who'd been constructing an elaborate fiction about our relationship, using me as a prop in whatever narrative he'd been selling to his professional community. And now I had the power to correct that narrative with surgical precision. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. Christopher had texted me at 12:47 a.m., a perfunctory "hope you got home safe" that managed to sound both concerned and completely detached from any responsibility for my welfare. I ignored it, along with the follow-up message that arrived Thursday morning. "That was so much fun last night. I found this great Italian place near my office we should try next week." The casual assumption that there would be a next week, that Tuesday's abandonment had been a minor blip rather than a relationship-ending revelation, was almost endearing in its complete misreading of the situation. But I let him believe it. In fact, I encouraged it. "That sounds lovely," I texted back Thursday afternoon. "I'm so excited to meet your coworkers at the barbecue this weekend. You've talked about them so much, I feel like I know them already." The response was immediate and enthusiastic, a long paragraph about how proud he was to introduce me to his team, how perfect we were going to be together, how this was exactly the kind of stability he'd been hoping to demonstrate to his colleagues. Friday evening, I received a text that made my heart sing with vindictive joy. "Can't wait for tomorrow. I've been telling everyone about you all week. This is going to be perfect." Perfect. Yes, it certainly was going to be that. Saturday afternoon, I dressed carefully for the barbecue. Not the outfit Christopher had seen me in before, but something that projected confidence, independence, and just a touch of "you have no idea what's coming." I arrived exactly when I'd promised, finding Christopher near the grill, animated and clearly holding court with a group of his colleagues. "Everyone," he announced with obvious pride as I approached, "this is the amazing woman I've been telling you all about." The introductions were warm, the small talk easy, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the company of his coworkers, which made what happened next even more satisfying. About 30 minutes into the party, as conversations had settled into comfortable rhythms and Christopher had relaxed into his role as the proud boyfriend, I found myself in a group that included Jessica and two other women from his department. The conversation had naturally drifted toward relationships, dating in your 30s, the challenges of finding someone who really understands partnership. "It's so refreshing to see Christopher with someone who seems to really get him," one of his colleagues said, smiling warmly at me. "He's been absolutely glowing this week, talking about how considerate and thoughtful you both are with each other." The opening was so perfect I almost couldn't believe it had been delivered so naturally. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational, "that's so sweet of him to say." Though I have to admit, I was a little surprised by his approach to consideration on our last date. I paused, letting curiosity build in the group. "I mean, I understand everyone has different perspectives on what thoughtfulness looks like in a relationship." Jessica, bless her, picked up the thread immediately. "What do you mean?" And so I told them, not with anger or dramatic flair, but with the calm, factual precision of someone recounting a mildly interesting anecdote. How Christopher had suggested the location and timing. How he'd mentioned not drinking because he'd be driving me home. How he'd left me alone at nearly midnight in an unfamiliar part of the city to pay surge pricing for an Uber home. The silence that followed was exquisite. I watched understanding dawn on their faces, saw them processing not just the story itself, but what it revealed about the man they worked with every day. The colleague who'd praised Christopher's thoughtfulness was staring at me with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for particularly gruesome true crime podcasts. "He left you alone at midnight?" Jessica asked, her voice carrying the perfect note of professional concern. "In that warehouse district?" "Oh yes," I replied cheerfully, though to be fair, he did text me 20 minutes after I got home to make sure I'd arrived safely, so there was definitely some consideration involved. The look that passed between Christopher's female colleagues in that moment was worth every penny of that $73 Uber ride. It was the look of women who suddenly understood they were working alongside someone whose character they'd completely misjudged, someone whose definition of acceptable behavior toward women was fundamentally different from their own. But the real masterpiece came when Christopher himself approached our little group, completely oblivious to the shift in energy, sliding his arm around my waist with proprietary confidence. "What's everyone talking about over here?" he asked, his voice carrying that easy charm that had fooled me for 3 months. "Actually," I said, turning to face him with a smile that I'm sure looked perfectly normal to him, "I was just telling everyone about our date Tuesday night. How you handled the transportation situation." I watched his face cycle through confusion, dawning recognition, and then something approaching panic as he realized I'd just shared his most damning moment with his entire professional peer group. The look on their faces when they realized they'd been caught was priceless, but the look on Christopher's face when he understood that his carefully constructed professional image had just been demolished with surgical precision was absolutely intoxicating. He stammered, his arm dropping from my waist as if I'd suddenly become radioactive. I was really tired from work, and I thought. "Oh, no need to explain," I said, my voice bright with false reassurance. "I completely understand that everyone has different approaches to these situations. I just thought it was such an interesting example of how people show consideration for each other." The silence stretched out like a beautiful, terrible symphony. Christopher's colleagues weren't even trying to hide their judgment now, their expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. I could practically see them reevaluating every interaction they'd had with him, every casual conversation about workplace dynamics, every moment when they'd given him the benefit of the doubt. "Well," I said, checking my watch with theatrical consideration, "I should probably head out. I have dinner plans with friends tonight, and I want to make sure I leave myself plenty of time for transportation." The emphasis on that last word was subtle enough to seem accidental, pointed enough to land exactly where I intended. Christopher followed me toward the parking area, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "Wait," he said, catching up to me near my car. "I don't understand what just happened back there. Why would you tell them about Tuesday? That was between us." I turned to face him, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I let him see exactly what I thought of him. "Christopher," I said, my voice calm and clear, "what happened Tuesday wasn't a private disagreement between partners. It was a character test, and you failed it spectacularly. The fact that you thought it was something to keep between us just proves you know exactly how wrong it was." "But I texted you to make sure you got home safe," he protested, as if that somehow balanced the scales. "You texted me 20 minutes after I got home," I corrected. "After I'd already navigated surge pricing, late-night traffic, and the anxiety of being abandoned by someone I trusted." "Your text wasn't concern, Christopher. It was guilt management." I watched him process this, saw him struggle to find some response that would restore his position as the reasonable one in this situation. "Look," he said finally, his voice taking on that patronizing tone men use when they think they're being magnanimous. "If this was really such a big deal, you should have said something at the time. I would have stayed if I'd known you were going to be upset about it." And there it was. The final gift. The perfect crystallization of everything that was wrong with his character, delivered with such unconscious precision that I almost wanted to thank him. "Christopher," I said, unlocking my car door, "the fact that you needed me to explain why abandoning someone at midnight is problematic tells me everything I need to know about your capacity for basic human decency. The fact that you're angry at me for telling the truth about what you did tells me everything I need to know about your integrity." I got into my car, rolled down the window, and delivered the final blow. "But don't worry," I said, starting the engine. I'm sure your colleagues will forget all about this eventually. Professional communities are usually very forgiving of patterns of inconsiderate behavior toward women. I'm sure it won't affect your reputation at all. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Christopher in my rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot, finally understanding that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate moment. Justice had never tasted so sweet. The phone calls started that evening. Christopher, of course, left several increasingly frantic voicemails, each one cycling through a different strategy: anger at my betrayal, confusion about why I'd made such a big deal out of Tuesday, and finally, desperate attempts at negotiation. "I'll drive you everywhere from now on," one message promised. "I'll pay you back for the Uber. I'll do whatever you want to make this right." But the truly satisfying calls came from Jessica and two other women who'd been at the barbecue. They wanted me to know that Christopher's story had spread through their office like wildfire, that several women had come forward with their own stories of his boundary-pushing behavior, and that HR was now taking a much more interested look at his conduct with female colleagues. You know what the best part is? Jessica told me during our Monday evening phone call. "He actually went to our manager today to complain that you'd sabotaged him at the barbecue, like he was the victim in this situation. It was the final nail in his professional coffin." 3 weeks later, I heard through our mutual social network that Christopher had been restructured out of his position, though whether that was directly related to the barbecue incident or simply the culmination of a pattern of behavior that had finally attracted official attention, I couldn't say. What I could say was that the women in his former office had sent me a group thank you card, expressing gratitude for helping them see clearly what they'd been dealing with. But the real victory wasn't professional or social. It was personal. It was the knowledge that I'd trusted my instincts, refused to gaslight myself into accepting unacceptable behavior, and demonstrated that actions have consequences even when people think they can get away with them. It was the satisfaction of knowing that Christopher would never again be able to claim ignorance about what basic consideration looks like, because I'd educated him in the most public way possible. Most importantly, it was the reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone shows you who they are is to make sure everyone else gets to see it too. Because the truth isn't cruel or vindictive. The truth is just the truth. And sometimes, the truth is exactly what someone deserves. 6 months later, I met Daniel at a coffee shop in my own neighborhood. When our first date ran late and the conversation was too good to end, he didn't hesitate to drive me home, walk me to my door, and make sure I was safely inside before leaving. When I thanked him for his thoughtfulness, he looked genuinely confused by my gratitude. "Of course," he said simply, "that's just what you do." And that's when I knew I'd learned the most important lesson of all. The right person won't make you grateful for basic decency. They'll make basic decency feel like the absolute minimum starting point for something beautiful.